Hello, psychology students. I'm sorry to be missing you today. If you need anything, please text me on Remind. I'll be available on my phone if there's anything that you need. Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We were using notebooks, and so please get your notes all ready to go. And while you're doing that, here's a quick review. We started with the beginnings of psychology and a guy named Wilhelm Wundt, who helped develop the very first psychology study and laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, and ended up with the very first lab that was experimenting with sound versus consciousness of sound. We moved to Edward Titchener, if you remember him, and the structuralists, and how he was requiring introspection, how people needed to talk about how they were sensing different things, but we talked about how that was really a subjective way to gather evidence, and that led to William James and things like functionalism in response to that, and how it didn't really matter what the structure of the mind, how that worked, but he felt like the function that it served was more important. And then we moved on most recently to talk about behaviorism. We talked about people like B.F. Skinner and John Watson, and we looked at Pavlov's experiments, and we'll look a lot more at those in future units. And also little Albert and kind of the morality around different types of experiments that were done by the behaviorists, and whether we think that that was an appropriate way to gather information or not. It led to the development of some ethics around psychological study and studies in general. And then finally, the last person we talked about was Freud and psychoanalysis. And if you remember, Freudian psychology emphasized the ways our unconscious thought processes and our emotional responses to childhood experiences affect our behavior. He talked about dream interpretations and free association and all sorts of things. Some of what he proposed has been kind of debunked, but others have become kind of foundational in the way that we practice clinical psychology today. Today, we're going to talk humanistic psychologists, and we're going to talk about Maslow, and we'll talk about a cognitive revolution, and away we go. The last thing I asked you to think about was your sense of belonging and what you belonged to, and there were people in the room that shared, and I appreciate you guys being willing to share at this point, because I know we don't have a sense of safety built up in the room yet. It's not enough time. But Lauren shared things like she was grateful for her friend group, which she felt like provided her a sense of belonging. And I think Anthony shared that, his family provides a sense of belonging, but at the same time, sometimes with some strings attached and things like that. Anyway, we spent some time talking about that. And that's going to lead us into Abraham Maslow's work around humanistic psychology today. So as the behaviorists had done in the early 1900s, other groups are going to reject the definition of psychology that was current in the 1960s, largely that was developed by psychoanalysis, right? The first, the humanistic psychologists, which were led by a guy named Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, both found Freudian psychology and the behaviorists too limiting. So they're going to go back and revive some of the thinking that had been done by earlier people, but put a new twist on it. Rather than focusing on the meaning of early childhood memories or the learning of conditioned responses, the humanistic psychologists drew attention to ways that current environmental influences can either nurture or limit our growth. So in effect, the environment that we're in right now, does it help us build ourselves up, or does it hold us back? That's, generally speaking, what they were concerned about. The humanist psychologists drew attention to ways that current environmental influences can either nurture or limit our growth potential, and to the importance of having our needs of love and acceptance satisfied. And in fact, one of these two is going to say that if you don't have those needs satisfied, at least initially, he said, that it was really difficult for you to even be your best self at all. So now let's talk a little bit about Carl Rogers, who's up here on the top right, who actually has a fairly large impact on some of the educational psychology that's used in your educational system today. And this is Abraham Maslow down here, who also is really key in educational psychology. Every teacher is trained in Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow's work. Whether they put it to use or not is different, but you're all trained that way. You can't get through educational preparation without it. So Carl Rogers on the top right, he actually started off kind of I'll tell you a little bit about each one of them because that always helps me. He actually started off with a really religious background, He was born in the early 1900s, in January of 1902, and he would die in 1987. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But he grew up in a really religious household. He was really intelligent. He could read before he was in kindergarten. His education was really strict religious and ethical. It was towing the line type of education that he received. He was really an isolated, kind of independent kid. He was really self-disciplined. Anyway, he actually was in a seminary school for a while and then left it probably when he was in his early 20s to move away from that kind of seminary and theological training, which is religious training, to work in an educational teacher's college. And when he did that, he started to get involved in child studies, and in particular, studies with kids that were struggling. And what he came to believe is that student-centered approaches were really necessary for kids to reach their full potential. So today, there's a movement around student-centered approaches, and this is why you would do small projects, slides you're responsible for. The last mental illness day when you were doing that exhibit work, that's very much like Carl Rogers-esque student-centered stuff, where if you have control, the onus of control is with you, the loci of control is with you, that you absorb and take on more responsibility, and as a result, own your learning. Anyway, he would eventually, though, go on to develop theories for teachers' education. He would get married to a lady who worked in the same field as he did. Her name was Helen, and he would go on to have 2 children. Okay. Later on in his life, he's actually, by the way, also considered in the top 10, in fact, number 2 on some people's lists, important as far as clinical psychologists and the things that he did around that. Later on in his life, he would fall. He'd break his pelvis and fall, and in an effort to repair that damage, he was in surgery and had a heart attack while going through surgery. And so he would die when he was 85 years old. Okay, spent most of his life in California. Kind of interesting, at the tail end of his life, he became an atheist. So while he grew up in a very religious household, really strict religious upbringing, and even studied to become part of a theologian, would eventually become atheist. His partner, for a good deal of time, was Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow is interesting for lots of reasons. Abraham Maslow is responsible for Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you guys have heard about before because I've taught my students about this before in classes other than psychology. His theory is about people achieving self-actualization. His theory is this, that like a pyramid of needs, you have needs that if they're not met, if your basic, foundational needs are not met, that it's really difficult for you to achieve self-actualization, for you to be your best self. So he says at the very bottom of these things he calls salient needs are your just basic physiological needs, that you need sleep, you need food, you need a secure place to be, you need a safe environment to live, you need to be able to breathe, obviously, you need to be able to function, do your regular bodily functions. And if those things aren't met, that it's really difficult for you to sit in class, or for you to reach your best self for the day. And I would imagine that that is true. I mean, even if you're in class, if you're distracted because you didn't sleep last night, or you're starving because you haven't eaten in 2 days, it's pretty hard for you to focus on what's in front of you. He says next up the ladder is like just feeling safe in your own person. And if you're concerned, overly anxious, I was reading through your anxiety responses the other day. If you're extremely anxious about, your family or the health of a close family member or the health of yourself, or if you're not feeling secure and safe in your own body, you can't get a restraining order against somebody, that you need to feel safe about yourself, that it's really hard for you to focus on the other things that are around you for the day. Just up from those sorts of basic needs are the need to belong to something, the need to have relationships with people. People argue about whether that has to include sexual intimacy or not, but the need to belong, that desire and need to belong, is really strong, and you can get that through friends and family, and some people get that through a lot of, through a singular relationship. But the need to feel like you belong to something is super powerful, and this is why people that don't have that need met will turn to things like, gangs. This is why gangs are such a powerful force, or nationalism and movements like the Nazi movement is so powerful a force, because it provides people with a need that is a basic need. It fulfills a need to belong to something. You also need to feel a certain sense of self as you move up the ladder. Respect of others and respect by others. I mean, a lot of you in your anxiety kind of surveys talked about that, how you feel anxious about how others are perceiving you, and whether you're letting another person down that's around you. Usually your parents or your guardians were the ones that you talked about, but some people were worried about letting down teachers. And, if you're constantly working those things over in your mind, then this is an area where we all need to continue to work. Developing your own self-esteem so that that isn't as big a concern, it's not holding you back. Finally, he believes that after all of these other basic needs are met, then you can be creative, then you can problem solve, then you can be thinking, using higher order thinking skills and that sort of thing. Now, some people say, well, what about the person that, despite being homeless, ends up at Harvard? Because you've read stories about people like that. So Maslow went back and kind of modernized and edited his hierarchy of needs and said that, there are ways in which people can overcome these obstacles at the bottom. But he's saying, generally speaking, that it's hard to sustain self-actualization with these other things lacking, especially if it's a long period of time. The longer that you go without food, the longer you go without a sense of belonging, the more powerful that need becomes, and how it becomes more and more difficult for you to operate up here when those things aren't met. This theory is used by educational psychologists all the time, and this is why, especially in a school like this one where you have a high challenging population, why there's a lot of services provided for, food, shelter, coach drives, things like that, why we work so hard to build a climate of culture that you can feel safe and secure inside of the room, why we work hard to create climates that are open to not being critical of each other, and hoping to develop these skills right here, these self-esteem and confidence, respect for others, so that we can operate up here, because this is largely what you need when you get to college, because they will care less about all of this down here. The rebellion of the second group of psychologists during the 1960s is now known as something called the cognitive revolution, and it led the field back to its early interest in mental processes, such as the importance of how our mind processes and retains information. Cognitive psychology scientifically explores the way we perceive, the way we process, and the way we remember information. Cognitive neuroscience and interdisciplinary study has enriched our understanding of the brain's activity underlying mental activity. The cognitive approach has given us new ways to understand ourselves and to treat disorders such as depression, as we shall see in the next units.